9 a.m. on the dot, so let's begin. We're in our 9th class in church history today, and I'll give away our topic nice and early. We're going to look today at the 30 Years' War. So if you didn't get enough of the wars, well, there's some more. We're going to talk about that today. We've been making our way through history and the Reformation. Just a bit of recap: Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin, John Knox, and then Greater Europe Reformation. I think that's where we ended off over the last 2 weeks, looking at Europe and how the Reformation spread there. And the nature of having to deal with wars, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like quite pertinent to the Reformation, is just because these were sort of the result of what took place around the Reformation. You kind of have to know the context of what was taking place and then what set the basis for Reformation. And a lot happened in the powers that be, the monarchy and the House of Habsburg, that set the stage and made the ideal conditions or the worst conditions for the Protestant Reformation. I don't think Martin Luther really, even though obviously the Lord used him, really understood the ramifications of what would take place when he nailed his 95 Theses to that door. This would spark, obviously, a reformation and renewal of the Word of God, but it would really undo society, as it were, just as everything changed from Roman Catholic rule to an adoption of Protestant principles that even went into government. We'll see just the beginning of that today. This is going to be, just a reminder of you folks, this will be the last class in church history for now. We have 4 weeks of new members class starting next week, so just keep that in the back of your mind. So new members class will start next week for those who are interested in that. But today, we're still in church history, so that's great. We'll pick up things after those 4 weeks are done with the Puritans. So finally, we're going to start looking at Puritanism there. Okay, well, let me pray, brothers and sisters, and then we will get to this topic here together. Bow your heads with me. Lord, we're grateful today as you have used various men through history to pen down these stages throughout the church in its time, Lord, that we understand as having been providentially cared for and led along by you, preserved, Father. We're so thankful for this legacy. And as we look at this information this morning, we pray that, again, our hearts will be stirred unto the truth as we hear of the story of those who stood for the faith so strongly. God bless our hearts. Encourage the little ones here as they hear about those stories to have heroes in the faith. And God, just prepare us to receive this information, and may it be blessed. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so just like I said, the 30 Years' War. We're going to look at the 30 Years' War, biggest war in, you could say, medieval history. This war is so big, not only in its time span, 30 years. It's hard to imagine. There were certainly wars that lasted longer, but in terms of bloodshed, this is the largest. Prior to the 20th century, this is the largest war in terms of casualties of it. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get through, give you some statistics, but this is a horrendous war. And unfortunately, when we talk about the 30-year war, really the results didn't accomplish a whole lot, which is really a sad truth, which has its lessons for us this morning. Hopefully we can just meditate on that a little together, but I trust you'll be able to make those observations yourself just by hearing about it. So let's establish a bit of the groundwork. Let's go back to the Peace of Augsburg. Maybe you'll remember that from classes prior. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Post-Reformation, 16th century. So we're going back to that time period before we get into the 7th century and 18th century together here. If you remember the Peace of Augsburg, this was a concession, a peace, an agreed-upon document with Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire to the rising support of Protestantism. This was his concession. He was agreeing to disagree, you might say. He didn't agree with Protestantism. He was vehemently against it, but there wasn't a whole lot he could do. He was losing German support in his empire, and so had to agree to some extent with Protestantism to avoid the opportunity for rebellion that was beginning to mount against his power. There was already lots of hesitation about the Habsburg family and about his rule. He had an undivided kingdom, and so he had to do something about it. This was a very political move. This was not a move of his own religious conviction. He opposed Protestantism, so make sure you understand that. But this concession gave rulers and princes in Germany the ability to determine the religion of their territory. Very important. We've seen something like that in the Swiss Reformation, where you have individual provinces, individual regions of rule, where those who were elected to oversee those regions would either be Protestant or Catholic, and they had the freedom to do so, which really shaped that region. Well, we have that freedom here as a result of the Peace of Augsburg. You have leaders of various regions in Germany who are Protestant or Catholic, and the intention behind this was that, well, the Protestants would go to the Protestant regions and the Catholics would go to the Catholic regions just by nature. So if you had a cardinal or you had a bishop of some sort ruling over a particular state, sometimes you'd even just have regular elected officials, just members of civilian life who took those positions. If they were Protestant, well, obviously that affected the region. The only unique part about this Peace of Augsburg is that it determined that whoever was in power, whatever their religious conviction was, had to define the religious conviction of everyone else. So if you had a Catholic leader, it made that state, it made that region Catholic by nature. You were forced to follow along with the leader, which obviously created a little bit of contention, even if Protestants weren't able to move to a more Protestant region. It gave freedom, certainly. If you wanted to practice Protestantism, you could go to that region, but it wasn't as possible for everyone to make that move. And so there was still difficulty, there was still division, even with the Peace of Augsburg established. And not to mention, the Peace of Augsburg excluded Calvinists. So it included Lutherans and Catholics and those with Reformed convictions. But if you were a Calvinist, which really wasn't that different, ultimately, it just differed on transubstantiation. But if you're a Calvinist, you weren't included. You did not get this right. You did not get this freedom. And so obviously that created quite a stir. The people are unsatisfied with Charles V's efforts here. And obviously that creates, as I mentioned, rising tension between Protestants and Catholics. So again, the pot is stewing. It's reaching a boil. Things are not unified despite the efforts to do so. Here's when we get into the 30 Years' War. Horrible period, unfortunately. Obviously, we could say some things certainly justified there. But in terms of escalation and violence, this is awful. So we get into the next emperor after Charles V, who is Rudolph II. Okay, now he is Holy Roman Emperor. Very Catholic, much like his predecessor, Charles V. Very Catholic, educated in Spain under the Jesuits. I think it's pronounced Jesuites. Again, that was a sect within the monks that was highly devoted to Catholicism and opposing Protestants. They had quite an influence. But Rudolph II's rule was very weak. He didn't really have the political know-how like Charles V, and a lot of his Catholic policies were outright refused. His rule was not appreciated, and a lot of his rule was opposed. Riots began. Okay, so again, the pot is stewing up. Riots are developing. Riots, particularly in a region of Germany called Donauwörth in 1606. Okay, so we're in the 17th century now, and you have total civilian unrest. This city became Protestant. This is a pretty large region, pretty influential region. It's on the border of Catholic Bavaria. That's an important note, okay? So Donauwörth is on the border of Catholic Bavaria. So you have this Donauwörth region, which is devoted to Protestantism, and you have right over to the east, Bavaria, totally Catholic. Now, in Donauwörth, remember the rule, the Peace of Augsburg, rulers are Protestant, the people are Protestant. There was a Catholic monastery there that was allowed to be sort of the sanctuary for Catholicism, but Catholicism would not be allowed to be practiced outside of that monastery. And the monks started to get bolder with their faith. They would leave the monastery in their holy procession, practice in public, and they would end up receiving much of the opposition of the Protestant majority there, sort of being cast out and hurling rocks and stuff and telling them to essentially get back in their monastery. And this came to the ear of Duke Maximilian of Bavaria. Remember that Catholic region right on the eastern border of Donauwörth in Germany. Maximilian of Bavaria does not like the way that Catholics are being treated. This gets more national news coverage, if you will. And so Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, here tensions are rising, he decides to invade the city and force conversion to Catholicism as a result. Wow, okay, taking things up a notch, which again reacts in great fights and squabbles and skirmishes, deaths and fighting. And as a result, you have what would be known as league formations, okay? League formations, Catholic League, Protestant League. Essentially, provinces and territories are banding together now. They're forming alliances to oppose each other and protect their provinces. Because look, this Duke of Maximilian, he is transgressing the borders of the Peace of Augsburg by invading a Protestant territory. So he's breaking the rules here. And so Catholics and Protestants form leagues to defend their territories. And we have... Or I'll give you a date for that, just so you know how close it was to the riot in Donauwörth. That would be 1608, when those leagues were formed. 1608. Now, we come to a very important point in the 30 Years' War history. This would be the spark that would light the 30 Years' War ablaze, and it would be known as the Defenestration of Prague. It might be pronounced differently, French, but that's what I have here. The Defenestration of Prague, which essentially just means throwing someone out a window. And I believe this is the second time in history that this would have taken place, but this was the most notable. So follow along here. You have neighboring Bohemia also. So we're talking about Donauwörth, we're talking about Bavaria, now we have Bohemia. Bohemia had become predominantly Protestant as well, just like Donauwörth. So Bohemia has tons of influence of Protestantism here. There was, as a result of that, I should mention, the reason for that was the presence of Hussites that were there for a long time under Jan Hus. So there's an influence of Protestantism in that region for quite some time. A lot of Protestant refugees as well that had left their provinces where they were being oppressed would move here to Bohemia for refuge. In the midst of this, Rudolf, remember Rudolf, Emperor Rudolf II, he abdicates. So he's over all Germany. He abdicates his control to his brother Matthias. And Matthias, not a great emperor as well, also very Roman Catholic. Matthias takes the opportunity amidst this Bohemian Protestant work and advancement to appoint Ferdinand, who is his cousin, as king of Bohemia. So again, remember the throne of the emperor has been passed off to Matthias. Now with that rule, Matthias appoints his cousin Ferdinand king of Bohemia. That's going to create problems, okay? Bohemia is becoming advanced in Protestantism. This is not going to be good. So he creates or puts this Catholic man in power, and that creates a Protestant rebellion, at least the beginning of it, a great Protestant banded opposition. And so when this king, Ferdinand, comes in and he's put into his rule, he immediately starts to put in place Catholic rulers, Catholic advisors, and Catholic laws, as I mentioned. And the Protestants band together and demand to be heard for their objections to this king and his policies in a Protestant region. But these advisors to King Ferdinand just shut him out. No, we're not even going to hear you. We're not even going to hear you. So there's a court, essentially, and they have the opportunity to speak, but they're just shunned. And revolt breaks out in this court, essentially. And what happens is Protestants actually take the king's advisors and they throw them out the window. They throw them right out of the window. And history tells lots of different stories depending on what side of the story you're on, whether you're Catholic or non. The men actually survived. And guys, it's like 70 feet. So this is like a massive, this above 3-story tower, essentially, these men are thrown out. Catholics say that the angels came and rescued them as they were falling out of the building. That's what their history will say. But if you look at Protestant history, more actual history, there's a big pile of dung at the bottom. This is a garbage heap, essentially. And so those men either fell in that dung heap or essentially rolled along the building wall to slow their fall. They survived, anyway, at the end of the day. And this was, like I said, the spark that lit the 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants. Again, this would be the most devastating war prior to World War I in terms of casualties. So this was a massive slaughter, not just because of those who were killed during the battle, but because of the civilian loss due to sort of mercenary armies being hired. These men were living in war for so long. We'll talk about this in a bit, but they just invaded areas, decimated areas, especially under the Catholic rule. There were armies that, again, were mercenaries under a name we're going to look at, and they were cruel men. They took out cities, burnt them to the ground. All sorts of wicked deeds were performed by them. And also plague as a result. You have invading armies, right, that are coming into the territory of Germany, carrying all sorts of diseases. They invade Germany, people die, plague spreads, everybody's sick. Awful, awful, awful death count. So, the war itself, Bohemia, okay, so this is where we're talking about a lot of these problems began. Back in Bohemia, again, these advisors are thrown out the window. Protestants band together, and what they do is they call their own king. So in an effort against the king, Ferdinand, who's been put in place, they say, we reject that king, we're putting in our own king, and they call a man named Frederick of the Palatine, or the Palatinate, I think is the proper word. Frederick of the Palatinate, which was essentially a bunch of regions in Germany. He's a Protestant. He was I think he was a Lutheran leader, so very for the Protestant Reformation, but had a lot of power, a lot of control, and had been hearing about what was happening. So they call this man to come and be king, who does take the position. In the background, we have Matthias, who dies. Remember, he was the emperor who appointed Ferdinand to that position in Bohemia. Matthias dies, and guess what happens? The only one in the line is Ferdinand, that king of Bohemia. Now he takes the emperor position. So now he is not only king of Bohemia, he is also Holy Roman Emperor. He has a lot more power. And so what he does as Ferdinand II, now officially, is call upon the Catholic League to fight alongside him, to depose this Protestant king, and he calls Maximilian of Bavaria to invade Bohemia. So now he's got essentially armies, 2 armies on his side. He's got the Catholic League, and he also has Maximilian of Bavaria's armies. And unfortunately, the Protestant rebellion is crushed, devastated in Bohemia. There was a battle there called the Battle of White Mountain, if you're interested in knowing more about it. They just didn't stand a chance. These were men who were, for the larger part, peasants rising up to fight against these other trained armies, and so they were slaughtered. Unfortunately, Frederick of the Palatinate, he was deposed as king, not killed, not executed, but all of his lands were stripped. All of his oversight and his power there was taken, and all of the Palatinate, all the control, the reformed provinces that he had oversight on, were given to Maximilian of Bavaria, who helped Ferdinand invade. So you can just see now power is beginning to be conglomerated in Catholic control. So you have Bohemia is restored now to Ferdinand II, now the emperor, and now with that power consolidated in Catholic control, Protestants are seriously persecuted. They don't have the power, the thrust that they had there for a moment, and they're slaughtered, they're killed. Heavy persecution. Many are exiled, actually, officially from the country by 1626, a little bit later. But just to note some of the casualties of the 30-Year War that this strikes, Bohemia actually lost 4/5 of its entire population to war. Like, that's a massive number. 4/5 of your entire population slaughtered. And we're just talking about civilians, yes, soldiers, right? Protestant soldiers, of course, but the Protestants would also hire mercenaries as well to fight for them in their battles. So this is just a devastating loss of life here. 30 Years' War is beginning here. Now, we come into the stage here where you have Denmark. This is sort of, you can call it the Denmark, the Dens stage of the 30-Year War. We'll work our way to that. There's a Swiss portion too later, and then a French portion. 1626, okay? 1626, you have Protestant leaders rising together and talking about, what do we do here? England, Netherlands, and Denmark, they have their own league where they propose, well, what do we do? We need to invade Germany and restore Frederick of the Palatinate. So, because the thing is, Frederick has a name. This man who owned the Palatinate, and then at his title, his kingship stripped and all of his land, he's got powerful relations. Frederick is the son-in-law of James I of England. So this man is not a man to be trifled with. They're making enemies. Essentially, the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, he made big enemies with that move. And there's lots of concern among Protestant power regarding the advanced power of the Habsburg house. And again, that's just another way of describing the emperor's house, that line. They have so much power, so much conglomerated power and control that even Catholics are worried about that. And Protestants, whether or not it's the defense of their own people, certainly were also very concerned. This is becoming a tyrannical power, so we need to oppose it. So, Ferdinand, though, is catching wind that forces are on his doorstep and they're going to fight him. And so Ferdinand fortifies his forces, knowing that there's an invasion on the doorstep. Ferdinand, the emperor, fortifies his forces under the command of a man very notable named Albert of Wallenstein. So now, here we go. He's got like three forces, Ferdinand. He's got the Catholic League. He has Maximilian's forces. And he now has this new commander, who's essentially a mercenary commander, Albert of Wallenstein. Albert Wallenstein would probably be the best out of all of those in terms of his battle knowledge. And so now, going back to that Protestant band together, they decide to send Denmark. Denmark's forces come and they invade Germany under Christian IV. Christian IV of Denmark invades, but now he's got multiple armies to fight. And this is a slaughterfest. An awful slaughterfest for multiple years, I think 4 years. Back and forth, wars fought, cities, Protestant cities, sacked and slaughtered. Just utterly devastated. Loss of casualty life, lots of civilian life. Germany is just becoming a nation ransacked by war at this point, where the people are growing tired of this. I don't have a ton of time to talk about each battle, but essentially this is just massive fighting between Protestant and Catholic armies, Denmark, and then obviously the Holy Roman Empire. After ravaging Germany with war, a treaty is reached. It's called the Treaty of Lubeck, and that's in 1629. So we went from 1626 to 1629 in wars. That's when the Danes, they withdraw. Everybody essentially agrees to peace. Like, we're not accomplishing anything. Nothing has been gained. Everybody is dying. And so a treaty with very little agreement is actually reached. So you just have a loss of life for very small amount of reasons. And unfortunately, the Danes' efforts to push back against Catholicism is unsuccessful, because those powers under Ferdinand just continue to increase. Ferdinand issues or institutes something called the Edict of Restitution. It's unfortunate because he probably had the power to lessen this. Okay, we've had peace, no more battle. I'm not going to instigate any more problems with the Protestants. I'm going to pursue some form of harmony here. But instead, he is very devoted to the advance of Catholicism, and he institutes this Edict of Restitution, which is super problematic. Essentially, what it says is that all lands owned by the Protestants are to be reclaimed, and many Protestants, even though I don't think it was typically or actually explicitly put in that restitution, but Protestants would be forced to convert, and they would be displaced and exiled from their land. So, I don't know, this man, obviously, bad ruler. from a Catholic side, just not politically advantageous at all. Just creates more war. So again, we have an edict that creates more persecution and unrest. So enter the Swedish section of the 30-Year War. Den section, Swedish section. Gustavus Adolphus, very well-known name. He's a really important name in the Swedish section. This man is essentially called the father of the modern warfare. Gustavus Adolphus from the Swedish territories, Protestant, Lutheran man. He was the first man on the battlefield to actually bring mobile artillery. So this is the first time that cannons have wheels. Nobody knows how to deal with this because essentially as the armies of Ferdinand II come up against his people and they try to flank their armies around, they can simply move their cannons over, put them in that area and dominate the battle, which is exactly what happens. So Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden from 1611, that's back in time, but he's king during the time of the war. He was a decent king. He was a very able ruler. And as he's king in Sweden, he has a lot of problems, not only for Protestant reasons, but politically, against the Habsburg family, against Ferdinand II, because the Habsburgs are actually attempting during this time to gain possession of Swedish lands, actually trying to force away lands from Gustavus and invade on his flank on the Baltic Sea. And he's a Lutheran. He has great problems with this. And so he joins and fights back against this formation of the Edict of Restitution with his own armies. So he invades Germany. And as a result, Wallenstein, remember that name, that's the mercenary leader under Ferdinand. His army is disbanded due to Ferdinand's, is slaughtered essentially, at least at the beginning in the war, due to just the ability of Gustavus Adolphus and his military power. As their fighting goes on, and this is a region again where Ferdinand is decimating, he is awful, he is cruel in his efforts to undo and to put to death Protestants. I think it's in this time when he slaughters Magdeburg as a city, killing tens of thousands of Protestants. Just awful. But at this point, that mercenary leader under Ferdinand is drawing a lot of concern. Wallenstein, under Ferdinand's power on the Catholic side, is gaining a lot of power and influence, almost to compete with Ferdinand's. And so there's sort of an infighting on the Catholic side between Ferdinand and Wallenstein. And so actually Ferdinand gives Wallenstein the boot. Ferdinand's army is disbanded because of Wallenstein's army is disbanded because of Ferdinand's concern over growing power. So that lessens quite substantially the power force on the Catholic side. And so now Ferdinand, the emperor, is left against Gustavus Adolphus with merely his own Catholic league at this point. I don't even think he had Maximilian on his side. So Adolphus is very successful in fighting against Ferdinand. He demolishes Catholic forces with his mobile artillery. He actually treats the population fairly well in Germany. It's not perfect. His army is still mercenaries, but he's a good leader. And so as a result, the Germans are somewhat won over to this Protestant invader in their lands, fighting for them. They are ruined by war, but he treats civilians far better. He doesn't impose much of his will. He says he is essentially there to defend. And what's interesting in the background, we're hopefully going to get time to look at that, we'll see today, is that he's actually funded by the French. So the reason Gustavus Adolphus, the Swede king, is able to continue and battle and in essence exhaust Ferdinand's military power and financial means is because he has the background support of the French. Which is, you might say, what? French? They're Catholic, right? The French are Catholic, which you're absolutely true in saying. The problem is that the French are also opposed to the growing power of the Habsburg family. And so you even have a cardinal in the background filtering the king's money into the Swedes' power just because they have a growing concern politically about the Habsburg family. We'll hopefully have time to look at that later. Peace hopefully is on the horizon here. Gustavus Adolphus gains a lot of territory. He invades Bohemia. He threatens Bavaria. He's taken a lot of land and power back. The Catholics are actually preparing for a peace agreement. They're going to give in to his conditions. But Ferdinand, in desperation, guess what he does? He calls on Wallenstein, the man he was concerned about, the mercenary leader of his armies that he hired before, calls him back in. We're losing forces. We're losing ground. I need you. I know you're a good leader of an army. He brings him back, and there's a final battle, a great battle between Wallenstein's armies and Augustus's armies at a battle called Lutzen, and massive casualties of war there. And Adolphus's army ultimately wins the battle. And so they decimate Wallenstein's army, but Augustus himself is killed on the battlefield. So the leader of the Protestant army, the king himself, is actually killed. He was a pretty courageous king. He would ride out to battle himself with his men, essentially at the front of the charge. He did not want to miss a battle, but unfortunately it came at his own death. And as a result, the battle just the war denigrates into awful skirmishes and fights and desolation at this point of civilian casualties. The men of war, they're so used to battle at this point. It's been so many years living in war. That's all they know. And there's very little source of income at this point with a king gone, or on the other side with a very small army. They're robbing food from civilians. They're taking what they want. They're getting their pay essentially from the Germans just by decimating small towns and villages. It's awful. And Wallenstein sees that this is a hopeless sort of battle. He is secretly negotiating with the Swedes and the French and the German Protestants to just try to put an end to this nonsense, essentially. But as a result, Ferdinand hears about Wallenstein's efforts to kind of put an end under or behind closed doors, and has him killed, has him and all of his officers actually murdered. So this is just a mess. Eventually, it morphs into what would be known as the Peace of Prague in 1635. But if you're thinking it's over, it's not over yet. And I'm going to wrap up really quick here. But the Peace of Prague, as it was known as, was only a temporary peace. It placed German states in the powers of the empire. But again, there would be concern politically, and the French, who were funding the Swedes, would now enter into the war themselves, seeing or fearing the threat of Habsburg rule taking over Germany. And so the French has an invested power in it, and they come and fight because the Spanish are all coming and invading Germany and taking it over. And they don't want that. They don't want the Spanish and the Habsburgs having all this power. And so France invades, fight. Germany is war-torn at this point. There is hardly anything left. The people are devastated, killed. So many have been slaughtered, died of various diseases. And finally, in 1648, like there's tons to talk about in the France portion. That's the third stage, the French stage. But we don't have the time to talk about it. Finally, what was known as the Peace of Westphalia. Peace of Westphalia is signed in 1648, putting an end to the conflict. The Germans are broken. They are depleted by war. Ferdinand dies in 1638. His son, Ferdinand III, is far more tolerant religiously, likely because he sees his dad's entire life devoted to war here. The Swedes in Germany are just tired and exhausted by war, depleted in funds. There's complicated negotiations still, but finally a peace is brought about. And the only real change is that France and Sweden, because they technically kind of won the battle, they have most of the profit. They gain a lot more lands. So France expands its borders to the Rhine. Sweden has more lands on the Baltic Sea, the North Sea. German princes are given a little bit more power. So that proves a bit of a hindrance to Habsburg authority. And they go back to the Augsburg, essentially, Confession, agreement, the Augsburg Agreement, where now not only are the rulers allowed to be Protestant or Catholic in rule, but the people are allowed to be Catholic, Lutheran, or Reformed. And buildings and institutions are to be returned to their original religious confession. So there's not a whole lot. There's a little bit of advancement for religious tolerance, but it's not that great. I mean, it's not that beyond the Augsburg. So if you think about it, these 30-year war, what did they accomplish? Very little. Very little, and so much fighting between Protestants and Catholics, which was a natural thing. You were used to this back then. Right? The separation of church and state did not, at least it was not articulated yet. It had already been talked about a bit by the Anabaptists. But at this point, it's natural to defend. It's natural to fight for religion. But the unfortunate part about this is it came with such human loss. And so very little is changed. And unfortunately, there's a lot of growing sentiment at this point to move away from this kind of entire society. I mean, these are the kind of things, brothers and sisters, that set the stage for the French Revolution, essentially, because there's such an animosity towards fighting for religious purposes, and so you see a bit of a shift. I'm going to talk a little bit, we'll use the last 10 minutes to talk about the Church of the Desert. I want to talk about that. We're going to go into French Protestantism again. I'm going to have to move a little bit quicker to finish things off, but that's a 30 years war. Oh, okay, breathe. Whew. Hopefully no more wars, right? That's a big one. I wanted to make sure you knew that. That's an important event in history between Protestants and Catholics. It really set the stage for Puritanism as we go into the next century. So French. We did talk about French Protestantism. We're going to come back again. French Protestantism in the 17th century. We're going to be in that time of the 30 Years' War, but we're talking about other stuff. Henry the Fourth, if you remember, we talked about him in French. He was very tolerant of Protestants. He changed his religion 6 times. He was captured, put in prison, changed his religion, came to power, ultimately Henry Bourbon, and became a Catholic, unfortunately, but was tolerant of Protestants. He would eventually be assassinated by a Catholic monk or priest, I think, because they thought, hey, you're still Protestant. We know what you actually are. But a very good, well-ordered king. And he is assassinated, unfortunately, and as a result, Catholic opposition grows. You have King Louis the 13th, who, after Henry is assassinated, is only 8 years old, so he doesn't take the throne. But the regency is handed to his mother, Marie de Medici. And she, again, follows a lot of the thinking of the previous Henry IV. So she is far more for Protestantism. And the Huguenots actually give her their allegiance. They're fine with her. She's Catholic, but she is very tolerant. But problems arise because Marie has very many Italian advisors who are very close collaborators with the Habsburgs. So here we go again. Catholic influence, Catholic advising, Catholic conviction. And after that, Louis, her son, the 13th, grows and is married to a Spanish princess, Anne of Austria, super Catholic. And his sister, Isabella, is married to the future Philip IV of Spain, super Catholic. So here we go again, in marrying with Catholicism. And guess what's going to happen? We're going to move all the way back to Catholicism, and all that progress, unfortunately, is going to be lost. In the providence of God, we know there's a reason, but there is a Huguenot uprising as a result because they know what's happening. These marriages cause them to stand up, take a stand, and oppose. But the Huguenots die. Many of them die as a result of standing against this new rule because they know they're losing their freedoms, and many of the leaders of the Huguenots are killed. Their strongholds are lost. Now, enter a very important name. Cardinal Armand de Richelieu. Sorry for the pronouncing, but that's at least how I see it. Armand de Richelieu. This man is a very important man. He rose to power in the French court as Marie, remember the regent, the mother of Louis, is losing influence. He's very Catholic, but he's also very politically minded. He is the king's most trusted advisor, and he is politically ambitious for his own power. And remember when we talked about the 30 Years' War, how Sweden had the support of the French. Well, this is a Catholic nation, right? This is a Catholic power. How are they getting support? How are Protestants getting support to fight against Catholics? Well, this man, Armand, he's very politically minded. He knows the Habsburg have too much power. And so he allows the king's assets to support Protestants over in Germany because he fears the growing power of the Habsburg family. Very interesting move. I'd say very interesting that he even had the ability to do so and the trust. But he has entirely different policies when it comes to France. Okay, so he's for the Protestants in Germany so long as it opposes his enemy, but he is not for Protestantism in France. It corrupts, in his mind, his country and his rule. He's not a king, he's just a cardinal with a lot of power. So his policies in France are awful. He sees the Huguenots as an infestation, as a problem. And the previous King Henry, who had given them their fortified cities, and even given them the ability to resist opposing powers, Armand removes. And in fact, he goes and he sets out to destroy those fortifications. He's a very militarily, politically smart and intellectual man. He knows the Huguenots, their source of power and defense are these fortifications where they're allowed to be protected and grown and propagated. And so politically he says those have to go. So he sieges the main Protestant refuge called La Rochelle, and it's a year-long Protestant siege, a year-long siege of this stronghold. And the Protestants hold their ground for so long, for a whole year. They fight back, but unfortunately they have to surrender because so many of them are killed in the battle or by starvation. And there were 25,000 Protestant Huguenots banded there. There are only 1,500 at the end of the year. It's awful. Other Protestants are obviously angered and they take up arms against the King Louis and the cardinal at that time, but they're unsuccessful. But very uniquely, a Toleration Act comes into place in 1629 under this Armand, because once he sees the fortifications taken and destroyed, well, that's all I was worried about. Now the Huguenots are stripped of their ability to propagate. So I'm fine. He gives them toleration. He lets them go back to and have their religious freedom, because in his mind, their ability to continue and grow in strength is gone. Okay, new kings and cardinals. I want to get to the Church of the Desert here. So Richelieu dies. That cardinal, 1642. The king dies, Louis, the next year. Then we have King Louis the 14th. He is only 5 years old. Here we go again. Another regent mother comes in, Anne of Austria. And this regent mother, in this new control and new power, entrusts the affairs of the kingship to Cardinal Jules Mazarin. And he was just a close collaborator of the previous cardinal. So basically, he's going to do everything the same. So he's actually pretty good. He gives a lot of religious tolerance to the Huguenots as well. And because of the religious tolerance, the Protestants are growing, again, in influence. The Huguenots are expanding. They're growing. Their influence is expanding. There's a lot more Protestants. There are a lot more Huguenot intellectuals, Huguenot scholars at this point, Huguenot nobles. And eventually, Mazarin, this cardinal, dies. And the problem develops against the Protestants, not when there's a cardinal in place, but when the king, Louis, this new King Louis, actually refuses to name a successor. And it's likely because he didn't like those rules. He didn't like how the cardinals gave freedom to the Protestants. He didn't like how they gave tolerance to the Huguenots. He says, nope, I don't want a cardinal. I refuse to have a cardinal. The Pope actually comes against him for it. But he says, no, I'm not going to. I do not want to have a cardinal. I'm going to oversee these matters of the Catholic Church. And he is far more awful. He wants to return France to Catholic rule. He wants to return the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and so he pursues Protestants under what he calls the reunion to Catholicism. He wants Protestants to convert back to Catholic, and have a more Catholic control. Eventually, at the beginning, his efforts are non-aggressive. He just persuades, he puts on pressure against Protestant Huguenots. He even tries to buy their conversion, quote unquote, to pay for them. If you're a Protestant, we'll come be a member of the clergy and we'll pay for you, because some of these really ungrounded Protestants said, well, if I convert to a Catholic, nobody's going to support me. Nobody's going to come to my parish because I've changed religions. And so I need your support. The king actually agreed to do so, pay for their support. And then he pursues very aggressive measures. There are violence that's brought against the Huguenots to force religious conversion. And we have what is brought about under this King Louis as the Edict of Fontainebleau. I think I did pretty well there on that one, just saying. The Edict of Fontainebleau, and this undoes the Edict of Nantes. And this is a big problem. This essentially undoes all edicts prior that gave any religious freedom to Protestants. It's illegal to be a Protestant. There's a mass exodus of French Huguenots to Switzerland, Germany, England, Netherlands, even North America. And as a result, what's interesting at this point is because so many Huguenots were scholarly and were in trade and supported economics so much that actually France plummets economically because so many of these Protestant Christians are kicked out. Well, they lose their whole economy, which is really interesting. Isn't that something, right? Christians are the hardest workers, and then you kicked out all your hardest workers. Smart one. Anyway, they are moved out. Many others are actually killed and opposed. And many, unfortunately, do convert to Catholicism. But what happens is there are no more official Protestants in France, quote-unquote official. At least there are many who converted, changed their religion to Catholicism. But you have a lot of convicted Protestants who are convicted in their conscience that they're not bold, that they perhaps changed under pressure. And so Huguenots, French Protestants are on the rise again. He tried to kick them out, but they're meeting illegally. They're meeting privately. They're meeting in the night. They're meeting in barns. And they're doing so with greater conviction because they're so, greater zealousness because they're so convicted in their conscience that they turn their back, right? That they were essentially cowards in the face of King Louis. And so the growth of these French Protestants in this time is advancing and advancing. Hardship come. There's greater persecution. If you were caught as a French Protestant worshiping at night or in a barn or something like that during the century, you would likely, if you were a man, be sent to be a galley slave. You'd be sent to be a galley slave. Your wife would be imprisoned. Your children would be put in the foster care of the Catholic Church. It's a horrible, horrible thing. You would lose everything. But that still didn't squash the growth of these French Protestants, who would be known as the Church of the Desert. The Church of the Desert. And a Church of the Desert because they're the Church of the Wild. They're meeting out in the wilderness. They're meeting out in the woods. They're meeting in barns. They're meeting in houses. And they are greatly opposed. Now, like many movements that are deeply, deeply opposed, you're always going to have a few radical wings because they don't have the opportunity to kind of get together and form their beliefs. So you have a few of those movements, but time is failing us, and so I need to wrap up. I just want to come to the end of our study today with what develops from this group of Christians called the Church of the Desert. This is where we get the French Reformed Church of the 18th century. A very strong movement of believers that essentially in this time, despite many of this sort of odd prophetic wings of those men in the Church of the Desert, there's a massive group of these Christians that are developing in France that want to go back to the Bible. They want to reform what's taken place. They want to develop Protestantism in a very strong way. And under the leader, Antoine Court, in 1715, you have the first synod of the French Reformed Church. These are biblical believers who are dedicated to scriptural authority and its clear exposition. It's even in their language, to exposit the scriptures. These men are incredible. Anyway, they are persecuted again, but cannot be stopped. These men go and they are trained in Switzerland. They get pastors trained. They come back. They're growing and becoming more and more biblical. And even by 1767, Reformed Protestantism is deeply rooted because of the efforts of these men by the grace of God in France. So that's where we got to close, brothers and sisters, to make some time for fellowship and others coming in. Let's bow our heads and give thanks to God this morning.